All right. Can everyone hear me now? All right, great. So my name's Josh Oos. It's a complicated name, Danish. So, yeah, you never would have got that. It's really, thank you. Thank you for not trying. Yeah, part of it. It's part of it. So I'm the executive director of ISRG, but we're really better known as Let's Encrypt. Internet Security Research Group is the company behind Let's Encrypt. So I've been told that I should give some background on myself, so I put this slide in here. I was a software engineer for a long time with SGI and Mozilla. And then I've started working on networking things at Mozilla. And while I was in the networking team, I learned a lot about HGPS and the challenges there. And when I became a strategist at Mozilla, one of the problems I wanted to solve was how do we move the web to HGPS? And I thought that I was going to work on this problem for a few months and come up with an answer, and then, people were going to make it happen. And it turned out, 5 years later, I'm still working on this. So we made the decision that we really need to start a new certificate authority if we're going to have HGPS everywhere. So that's what we did. I co-founded it with some people that I worked with and some other partners, and we did that in 2013. And now I run that organization. So I know that people here working at the intersection of technology and privacy and security, you're used to things working out pretty well. You've got all the answers. You're constantly impressed with how things work so well on the web. You're thinking to yourself, where are the challenges? Where are the things we don't know how to solve? And you might want to change a pace from that, but I'm not going to give it to you because this is a pretty happy talk today. And I'm happy to be able to give an optimistic talk. So I think we're going to encrypt the web. And I think we're going to do it pretty soon. So what do I mean by encrypt the web? What I mean basically is get to the point where the average person doesn't visit a non-HGPS website in a day, right? And that's not where we are now. But I don't think this is a pipe dream. It's something we can do in a pretty reasonable amount of time. I'm going to say 3 to 5 years. And what I'm going to talk about today is the plan for that. It was actually more like a 7 or 8 year plan, but we're into it a little bit, so now it's only 3 to 5 years left, I would say, assuming things keep going well. And I think people here are probably familiar with why we should do this, but I'm just going to state it again in case people are not. So the web has become very complicated. It used to be that you knew when you were submitting something sensitive, maybe it's a credit card, you could say, okay, I want to be secure here and I don't really care over here. The web's really complicated now. There's way too much data for you to try to sit there and think like, well, this matters and this doesn't and this matters. We can't pick through all that stuff anymore. We got to just assume that we need to protect everything at this point. And we got a lot of good things for that complexity. The web does a lot more than it used to. It performs a lot of functions in our lives, but we've got to deal with that complexity, and it's time to encrypt everything. The second point here, I think, is not stressed strongly enough in discussions about HGPS. So people think mainly about, oh, I'm going to hide the data that I send over the web. But there's also a huge issue of integrity. When you run a website, you want to make sure that people are seeing the content that you intend to present. And if your content's not encrypted with HGPS, you can't really be sure about that. You don't really know for sure that they're seeing what you're intending for them to see, your visitors. Ads can be inserted on the sort of like more innocuous end of the spectrum. On the other end, there's malicious JavaScript. And these things happen daily. They're going to keep happening. They're going to keep happening until we encrypt more traffic. And everybody's a target. This isn't like if you happen to be suspicious to a nation state, you're vulnerable to this. everybody's a target of snooping in and tampering on unencrypted data. And I always like to ask, how many of you think that your cell phone provider either mines your unencrypted traffic or tampers with it? Some of you. All right, maybe a majority. How about your home or business ISP? Yeah, roughly the same crowd. Government? Criminals? Yeah. Criminals are a little more on the paranoid end of the spectrum at this point, but I suspect it has happened. Yeah. Is there a difference? I don't know. So like I said, this is good news. We have a plan. It's a good plan. So I'm going to talk about this plan. It's a 4-part plan, the way I've broken it down here. So the first part of the plan is what I spend most of my time on these days, and that is making HGPS deployment easier. And there's sort of 2 subparts to this plan. When I started looking at what was holding up HGPS adoption on the web, it didn't take me too long to come to the conclusion that certificate authorities and the difficulty of interacting with them were one of the biggest problems. Not just difficulty, but there's price, ease of use, all sorts of issues. So if we're going to make HGPS deployment easier, we need easy to use, low cost, automated, high volume, and truly global CAs. But the second thing we need is, once you get a certificate, you've got to do stuff with that certificate. So we need better software infrastructure for HGPS deployment. That means the software that gets the cert, configures it, installs it, renews it, carries out revocation if that's what you need. And you need stuff for, your small home sysadmin, but you also need stuff that works really well for large enterprises. So Let's Encrypt is a really, in my mind, it is the solution that we have right now for the ease of use problem with CAs. So how many people have tried to get a certificate before from a CA? Yeah. How many of you would describe that as like a pleasant and reasonable experience? No hands, no takers. All right, well, it has been way too difficult. You got to figure out who you're going to get your cert. Well, first, frankly, you need to figure out that you even need a cert, and then you need to figure out who you're going to get it from. You got to sift through all the marketing terms. Every CA calls it like a different thing. It's because it's so special when it comes from here versus there, or whatever. Difficult processes put people off, and they don't scale. If you want to encrypt the web, you need solutions that scale. Let's Encrypt is making it a lot easier. One of the main ways that Let's Encrypt makes it easier is that Let's Encrypt is completely automated from start to finish. We don't do anything manual with our subscribers, like at least very, very few of them. Automation is really critical for scale. It's also critical for ease of use. You can write software to do things that people used to have to do for themselves. And that once that software is written and reviewed, it's much less error prone. So if you want a web scale PKI, you need to understand anything involving any manual effort is going to remain niche, and it has no chance of operating at web scale. This is not going to happen. So at Let's Encrypt, we do not involve anything manual in any of our processes. So cost is a financial barrier, right? Some people don't have enough money for a certificate. Certainly the way that people have been charging for certs for the past decade or so, that can be pretty expensive. But I would say that like the ability to come up with the money is not even the biggest problem with charging for certificates. Charging for certificates, even if you charge a very small amount, introduces a billion interaction, and that just kills ease of use. If you are setting up a test server inside an enterprise and you want to get a certificate and it costs even 2 cents, you got to pay that by credit card. You got to go find people in finance. You got to get a credit card. They're going to ask you how to itemize this cost, and you're just going to throw up your hands and say, I'm not going to do HGPS for this. This is too much trouble. We're going to only do HGPS on like special production things where it's worth my time to go deal with those finance people. And then there's all these questions of what are you going to do when the credit card expires? Are we going to not renew your cert that you've got automatically renewed in the cron job? We're going to take down your website. It just introduces a huge amount of complexity that goes far beyond the simple ability to pay for a cert. So that's I would say the main reason Let's Encrypt doesn't charge for certs is because it inserts manual interactions and just complicates getting a cert huge. So certs need to be available in every single country in the world, no exceptions, right? In a web where we expect HGPS and browsers enforce that, any geography that cannot get a certificate cannot run a website, cannot be on the web, right? We face a lot of challenges at Let's Encrypt because when we make policy decisions, we make them in the mindset that HGPS is going to be required. And anybody who can't get a cert is silenced, right? That's not the way CAs have been making policy for the last 20 years, but it's the way we make policy. It's why we are very defensive about the fringes and trying to make sure that every single person can get a cert if possible. We're very careful about revocation because in a world where the entire web is HGPS, you take away someone's cert, they're off the web, right? They cannot, you have silenced them. That's not something CAs in the past have faced. If you take away someone's cert, they just don't run encrypted, but they can still run a normal HGP site. So we want our stuff available in every single country in the world, and we have been that way from the start. There's no country in the world that we won't issue to. So we know there's a demand for this, right? Like we were theorizing this when I was sitting around at Mozilla thinking about it, but there is a huge demand. We've been around a little under 2 years at this point, and roughly 40 million FQDNs, active FQDNs. The demand is high and it just keeps going up. I talk to hosting providers every day about what their plans are and things like that. There are millions and millions and millions of sites that are going to come online in the next year using Let's Encrypt, and how many more are using other CAs. I'm really excited about this trend line. So I remember I said the second part of making HGPS deployment easier is better software infrastructure. So I don't want to say that Let's Encrypt has solved the CA problem, but it has solved a lot of the CA problems, at least for now. But we're still going to need software out there. So there's a few things that I think are good examples. So EFF develops CertBot, which is one of the main clients used to get certs from Let's Encrypt. And CertBot will also help you with things like configuration and installation with Apache or Nginx. Netflix Lemur is a underappreciated hero of HGPS deployment. When we talk to hosting providers or Fortune 500 or anyone who's managing just very large number of certs, right? It gets very difficult to manage that, and that's where Lemur comes in. So Lemur is has plugins for getting certs, then it will manage them, and has APIs for sending them to decryption, encryption endpoints, right? So that's been really important. And Caddy is a great example. Caddy is a web server written in Go, and Caddy has support for Acme and Let's Encrypt built in. So when you start Caddy, you don't even really need to know what it's doing with certificates. It just starts the HGPS version of your site with no clicks, just the same way it would start regular HGP. It gets a cert, sets it up. And it's where we really want to go, right? Like a Let's Encrypt client is nice because it's much easier than dealing with a CA in another way. But really, we just want your web server to do it. So there's not even a client necessarily. The web server should just know how to do it. And Caddy was, one of the earliest examples of that. But there's some more good news on that front, which is that right now, Mozilla and Let's Encrypt are working on bringing that system to Apache. So Apache has been a pretty standard web server for a long time. If you got Apache up and running, you could have a website on the web. That's still true today, but Apache today is not secure by default, right? Like, you start a website with Apache today, you've immediately got a security vulnerability on your hands. You can't guarantee the integrity of your content, the privacy. Apache just can't do it today. And we're going to fix that. So hopefully more servers will follow suit. So part 2 of the plan here is to make HGPS a new standard for hosting providers. The vast majority of websites out there, the people who own or maintain the website, they don't actually operate the infrastructure for the website. Somebody else does that, a hosting provider. If you don't get hosting providers to switch, you're not going to get the vast majority of websites to switch over. So we're making a lot of progress on that. We at Let's Encrypt spend a lot of time talking to hosting providers and saying, like, what do you need to make HGPS default free a part of every package? We don't want to see like this. HGPS is extra money. It's like a $10 add-on. It just needs to be default for everything. Some providers will, once it's possible, they'll make HGPS available to everyone because they know it's the right thing to do. Others are just not going to do it until they feel forced to do it. So, my strategy has been, once Let's Encrypt was up and running, we went to a few hosting providers that were better known, and we said, all right, we're going to help you get HGPS to all of your customers by default. And then we want you to go be really loud about this. So you've got it for default, and say that everybody else who doesn't is not secure, right? You're not secure. Just ram that message home. And then hopefully the dominoes will fall and the other web providers will fall in line. And that has really played out beautifully. I mean, that is how, when we look at Twitter traffic quite a bit, and there's a constant stream of Twitter messages saying like, such and such hosting provider, I've loved your service for 10 years, but you don't have HGPS anymore. What's wrong? Let's Encrypt is so easy. If you don't do it, I'm going to go over here, right? That's exactly what we need. We need that kind of pressure. Otherwise, the vast majority of sites are just not going to switch. So part 3 of the plan is to pressure top sites to default to HGPS. Top sites are not, their issue is not the ability to pay for a certificate. And they usually have a, excuse me. They usually have a bunch of staff around that knows how to set up certificates. So most of what we talked about is not the problem for top sites. The problem for them is that it's just plain a lot of work, right? There's a lot of content that they need to test and make sure it's going to work in the future. And they need a reason to do that work. And since the web browser acts like pretty much everything is fine when you visit a website that doesn't use HGPS, they don't see that motivation. So the only way we're going to get to them really is by applying pressure to them. So I would encourage people, you see a popular website that doesn't use HGPS, call them out on social media. File support tickets. Not running with HGPS is plain and simple a security vulnerability, and it's a huge one. Don't treat it as anything less than that. Find where you report security vulnerabilities to the website. Report a very serious security vulnerability. That's what it is. It's nothing less than that. You may, especially in this crowd, you might run into their employees. Bring it up. Just like every chance you get to drive this message home, drive it home. You can vote with your wallets and your attention. That's a little more difficult, but given 2 equivalent sources of news, pick the one that uses HGPS. You can also support advocacy organizations. So EFF does a lot of this kind of pressuring top sites. Let's Encrypt does a bit of it. So I'm going to use my pulpit right now to say thank you to these sites that have recently switched. There's a lot of traffic that gets encrypted. It's a big deal every time one of these sites switches. I'm also going to use this chance to point out some that haven't switched. There's a lot of traffic going to these sites every day, and it's very vulnerable. So part 4 of the...
Sorry, can you just go back? So the sites that have changed, they're using Let's Encrypt or just with any provider?
I don't think that either of these are using Let's Encrypt. And frankly, I couldn't care less, right? Like, I just want everyone to have HGPS. Get your search from Let's Encrypt, get them somewhere else, I don't care. Just get one and use it, you know?
Josh, on your next one, Baidu is a good example. And it goes with your slide earlier that says everyone is a target. Because if Baidu had been using HTTPS, the Great Cannon attack, the giant DDoS against GitHub wouldn't have happened. Because that worked by injecting malicious JavaScript into unencrypted HTTP responses.
Yeah. But if they hadn't targeted Baidu, they would have just used some other,
Well, yeah.
you know. And also, I think an interesting thing about these ones that are not encrypted, these aren't encrypted by default. I believe Baidu, Imgur, and Bing all have HGPS option. Like you can type that in, but by default, they're not HGPS. So most people don't see the benefit.
Yes, because he raised the point of if Baidu use HTTPS, the DDoS thing couldn't happen. But some of the theories say that that kind of DDoS is backed by the government. And if the government see that applying something on the internet in their own country cause them to lose some capabilities, but then I think I wonder what might be the difficulties for us as a community to put HTTPS on such websites. For example, in Baidu, if we believe in the theory that some government control Baidu to a certain extent to use as a tool to do something.
Yeah, so vulnerabilities, they work for everybody, right? So if you have this theory that like maybe the Chinese government doesn't want Baidu to be HGPS for one reason or another, because they want to take advantage of the vulnerable nature of it, just remember, everybody else can take advantage of that vulnerable nature too. So everybody else can attack Baidu, you know, just as well as the Chinese government can.
So, like specifically in terms of Baidu, it could be the case that the Chinese government is running their own CA, which they have all of the keys for, and they just man in the middle everyone. So it only works for them. That backdoor is just for them, not for anyone else.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by their own CA, like their own publicly trusted.
Their Let's Encrypt version.
I see.
And they can compromise all those certificates, but nobody else.
Yeah.
So that reasoning about, oh, but it's open for everyone else, the Russians, the US, whatever, it doesn't apply there.
I think that is tough to, I mean, they can play games like that, right? But still, I think Baidu encrypted by a malicious CA is probably still safer for most people than a Baidu not encrypted at all.
Very good point. But you also, again, you get a population of users that expect it. And then it's just, then somehow or other you get a minor adjustment in the government or in the government's own certificate authority. So incremental improvement is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And
What?
a billion users with expectations of what might be happening. That's what's changing the Chinese government. Just lots of expectations by individuals.
Yeah. And the thing about setting up your own malicious CA is if the rest of the world doesn't trust it, they're not going to ship with that as a trusted root. It's really complicated to set up your own CA, even if you're a government, because you're going to have to get that CA trusted by all the clients, but they're not going to trust it by default if it's known to be malicious.
I have a solution plan for this that I hope to talk to you about over lunch.
Okay. All right. I'll be around. Yeah.
I believe probably one of the reasons why these haven't been switching to HTTPS is probably due to the difficulty in deploying it. I know you may, of course, probably know about Stack Overflow that recently deployed theirs, but it was, by their blog post, quite a deal,
Yeah.
I mean, deploying that architecture and getting that hooked in and solving a lot of technical problems was a major barrier to getting that. And I don't know if that's within the scope of a CA or anything, but that's probably one of the reasons that is, on sites like fees are so big, it's difficult to just hook it into one, like,
Totally.
everywhere.
I mean, that's almost certainly a big part of the reason why. Except, I would say, with the exception of CNN, the other 3 sites here, they already have HGPS. You can go to HGPS version of Bing, Imgur, Baidu. It works already. They just don't make it default, right? And I don't know why they're not making it default. I've heard some arguments about compatibility in certain countries, but I'm not totally sure why they don't.
Wikipedia had that argument for a while. They were basically saying if they make HTTPS, it'll get blocked in certain countries and won't work out. And it turns out those weren't justified, and they did it and it was fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the weirdest question of HotPETs so far, at least. What's the impact on the environment?
I have got this question many times before.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I don't have an answer for you. I guess the way that I would think about it is like this. SSL used to be much more power intensive than it is now. Now modern processors handle encryption, decryption very, very efficiently, right? Vendors aren't selling giant SSL decryption boxes anymore because that's not really necessary. I think it's pretty efficient at this point, and I think there are probably a lot of decisions to make about the computing world that would have a much bigger impact than default TLS will, which isn't a reason to say that we shouldn't think about it with default TLS, but I feel pretty without having a total answer on the environmental question, I feel pretty comfortable that the privacy and integrity benefits of default TLS to humanity outweigh potential environmental negatives.
Okay, but so let me already ask a question. What's the cost? And it's pretty embarrassing though, I don't know. But is it like 1%, 10%, or factors?
I have
like
no.
a single,
You mean what is the power cost ratio of serving a web? I don't know the answer for sure. I suspect it varies quite a bit depending on your setup. But from the many organizations I've talked to, they have all either not brought it up at all or just said like it's negligible at this point. It just doesn't factor in. I don't know.
I know what I said, but yeah, maybe we should let Josh get a bit further and then keep all of this.
Yeah. Q&A is my favorite part. I much prefer that over listening to myself talk. So, yeah. All right. Wait, what's that? Yeah. So now we're on to plan part 4. And plan part 4 is sort of the knockout blow part of the plan. So this is where browsers come in. Browsers are the most powerful actors in all of this. Like, Let's Encrypt is a service that we put out there, and they say, hey, if you want certs, take them. Go to HGPS. But you can also just completely ignore our existence, right, and just keep doing what you're doing. But it is really hard to ignore what browsers are doing to your site. So they have a lot of power over this situation. So they need to show increasingly severe warnings for plain HTTP. They need to offer other incentives for HGPS, so carrots and sticks. And eventually we just want to get to the point where browsers don't load HTTP at all. So here's some things that browsers do. One thing that I think is very clever is to only allow powerful or new features if you're using HGPS. So just as a random example, Firefox will not allow you to use the geolocation API on your website unless you are using HGPS. That's a really great incentive to move to HGPS. You can increase the context in which HTTP receives strong warnings. So you can see here that Chrome initially shows you only these stronger warnings in an incognito mode, right? But they're gonna move to another context outside of incognito mode soon, or they're already partially there. And eventually, you're just gonna get this on all pages. So the scope of where you're providing warnings expands. And over time, you want the severity of those warnings to increase. And then, again, get to the point where you just block HTTP by default. So severe warnings or blocking is the only way you're going to get some sites to switch. It is the only way. So let's encrypt in all these other efforts. We can get a lot of the way there, but we're just never going to touch the last, I don't know, 10%. They're just not going to do anything. The only chance we have is to either put up huge warnings in the browser when you visit these sites, or just don't load them at all, right? Essentially remove that 10% from the web if necessary. It's going to be a pretty niche. I mean, 10% depends on what I mean by that. I don't mean 10% of page loads. I mean, of the hundreds of millions of websites out there, probably 10% of those, which average 0 visitors a day, are not going to switch. Is there a question? Yeah.
So I was kind of having a hard time to understand, so maybe it's a silly question, but what's the impact of using just plain HTTP for personal web pages, like our CVs or things like that? What kind of...
Yeah, so you're saying, are there some web pages that are so simple there's just no benefit, right? So when you put your CV up on a website, and presumably you want employers to look at that, would you like them to see the CV that you wrote, or would you like them to see the CV that someone else wrote when they inject it into your unencrypted traffic? Or would you like them to see your CV with a Verizon ad in the corner? I'm guessing you don't really want those things. You would like people to see the CV that you wrote as you wrote it. So the answer is HGPS, right? There's no... I'm so tired of that extra syllable on the end. I just get lazy and just want to drop it. So I have yet to have someone come up with an example of a web page that's not completely ridiculous that doesn't need HGPS, right? You need it for everything.
The one example that I think of is, I don't know, maybe you have a way of working around this. What about like captive portals and whatnot that you just have at hotels and other places where you need to log on to Wi-Fi? They a lot of times assume that you're going to go somewhere that's a regular HTTP site, and they use that to redirect you to their log on authentication page. And if you are going to HTTPS, a lot of times they'll just hang or break right there. And the scarier solution I've seen to that more recently is they'll offer you a certificate by the service provider that you're trying to log into, and I'm pretty sure that's not what we want to do is accept that.
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that is they're just going to have to figure it out, right? They've set up a crappy system, and they're going to have to fix it.
Yes.
So,
So one answer to the question about to ask might be, yeah, it's too niche, I don't care. But onion sites aren't eligible only for EV certs, and so anybody setting up an onion site would be, if your rules apply, then about browsers and stuff.
Yeah.
Get there.
I just don't know enough about how onion sites work to propose a solution to that. I just don't know the answer, but yeah. All right. Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned that if in a HTTPS only web, then people who don't have certs are silenced, and I agree with that. I mean, so let's say that you convince the world to streets, and then browsers don't show HTTP traffic. Then the CAs have great power, right? So I mean, you solve the problem, but then you have great power. So what's the backup plan? I mean, if you get crazy in other CAs and then you don't issue certs anymore, then what ensures that the web will stay open?
Yeah, somebody's gonna have that power. The answer I can give you today is that, lots of people think about Let's Encrypt as certs being free or maybe easy to use or something, right? But the governance structure of Let's Encrypt is really important to us because we've seen that coming, right? So we're a nonprofit. We're very transparent about our governance and our policies and things like that. You're going to have to pick somebody to control this, right? And that's always a risk. There's always a risk that you're going to make the wrong choice. So we're doing the best that we can for Let's Encrypt, at least. But yeah, we need to make sure that people running CAs or who have the ability to revoke certificates are people who are making reasonable choices about that kind of thing.
Yes, I have a very similar question to his, but it's more like a comment. So we can think of a certificate now as a digital asset, and if you lose that, you lose the ability to speak to the rest of the world via the internet. And you can think of smart contract like Ethereum as a platform to maintain that thing. And if we can have a sub-platform like once you write the code, when you deploy that, you can never take it down. Then if you want to already deploy a contract to do the CA stuff, then on the rainy day, they cannot decide to take it back. So they cannot decide to stop issuing new cert for those that get, and they cannot even take back the cert that they already give to somebody else. So
Yeah.
we can think of solutions to address exactly that question.
Yeah, I mean, blockchain is an interesting technology. I'm a little skeptical of a lot of its applications in the world today. Turns out some smart contracts are not, law. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to explore. I think we're quite a ways away from replacing the PKI system in any way. So when we thought about starting Let's Encrypt, right, we thought, well, there's all these problems with the current CA system, many of which have been enumerated in the comments here today, right? We know there's some big problems with the CA system. But if you want to fix it in a reasonable amount of time, you can't replace it. If we sat around and said, well, we're going to come up with a system that's much better than the CA system and solves all these problems, right? I would say the minimum for encrypting the web under a new system like that is 15, 20 years, maybe 25. You're going to be waiting a long time. And while you're waiting, you're not going to know if it's going to work, right? You don't really know how that's going to play out. So for us, we wanted a fully encrypted web in less than 10 years, right? We wanted 100% HGPS for almost all users in less than 10 years. And the only way we're going to do that is by working with the system we have. We throw it out, we're going to add another decade minimum. And people are just going to be insecure during that time. So there are definitely problems with the current CA system. I think Let's Encrypt addresses a lot of them, and it's going to deliver HGPS everywhere in the least amount of time that I think is possible anyway. I don't think there's a way to do it faster than we're doing it right now.
Do you have a canonical suggestion for what to show on a web page to get people to use the HTTPS version of it? I have this understanding, which might be wrong, that if you type in HTTP and it should be HTTPS, you get a redirect. But if your browser is set not to allow redirects, then it's an extra bit of confusion and trouble. And so I'm just, you folks with your planning and thinking expertise, have any canonical suggestion for how to handle that little bit of implementation?
It really depends on your setup, right? Like, your browser's not really making that redirect. It's how they've set up their DNS to redirect to HGPS. So I think the answer is we don't really have a suggestion other than that. If somebody makes a plain HTTP connection, you want to move them as quickly as possible off that.
I think the solution is fixing the browser to allow sort of the redirects and
Yeah, but I can't do that for every possible user.
No, but the solution is strict transport security, right? If the server sends back either is preloading or does the strict transport security, then the requests are going to be automatically rewritten, and then your browser won't have to redirect.
Yeah.
So it won't show up as a browser redirect. It won't be.
It's something you can do.
Yeah, it won't if you're using STS. Yeah.
As someone who recently did a very large web crawl, if you don't implement 302 redirect, so much other stuff breaks that this is irrelevant.
Yeah, this is outside scope of the CA.
Yeah. All right, where were we? Yeah, so I think the bottom line is that the browsers are the only way we're going to get the last percentage. But you can't have browsers jump straight to this for every HTTP site. Because one thing we know for sure is when warnings are too frequent, people just start ignoring them, right? they just become ineffective. So we need to use the first 3 methods in this plan, easier deployment, pressuring top sites, things like that. We need to deliver numbers to the browsers. The browsers want to do this. In fact, the browsers want to block all HTTP traffic, right? They've been wanting to do that for a decade. They just can't. It's just not possible. So we don't need to convince the browsers that they want to block HTTP traffic or put up huge, scary warnings. They're already convinced. What they don't have is the numbers, right? So we need to use these first 3 parts of the plan to give the browsers numbers, make it possible for them to make the warnings more and more severe. So we need to deliver them those numbers, and they'll be happy to put up the warnings as soon as it's practical. So that's the 4 parts of the plan. These are some miscellaneous things that are also helpful. So SEO bumps, most famously from Google. I'm not sure if other search engines do it or not. There's policies in law, right? Like you can require people to use HGPS in certain contexts. There's education. Education doesn't scale that well, but it can be particularly helpful for more vulnerable groups. And then there's research. What's working, what's not, what else do we need, things like that. Also very helpful. So this is just a quick summary of what I just talked about. 4 steps. So the plan is well underway. It's working, right? So here's where we are today. This is, I really started paying the most attention when Let's Encrypt launched. It was about 39.5% encrypted page loads on the web. And that's early December 2015. And that's 20 years of progress, right? HGPS had been around for 20 years at that point, and we got to 39.5%. That is not an acceptable pace of growth for HGPS. We got to do better. Good news is, almost immediately when Let's Encrypt starts, and to be clear, I'm not saying that Let's Encrypt is the only thing changing this, but it did have a big impact, right? The day Let's Encrypt starts, the rate of growth goes up hugely. So here we are, less than 2 years later, and we're at about 58%, so we're doing almost 10% per year right now. So if we keep that up, it's pretty easy to extrapolate that we'll get very close to 100% in about 3 years. You'll have that 10% left, but at that point, browser crackdowns are going to kick in much harder, and I think the rate will go up quite a bit once those browser crackdowns happen. So this is amazing progress. I don't think I can't think of any change to how the web works fundamentally that has happened at 10% a year. Certainly not IPv6. I'm not sure. I'm a huge IPv6 fan. I wish I knew what the 4-step plan for IPv6 was, but I don't. But this is amazing progress.
What happened in February and April?
So these are telemetry numbers from Firefox. What happened in February and April is that Firefox collects a bunch of telemetry data, but then has to process it. Their processing fell behind. It's not actually a change in the data. It's just processing less telemetry. So it's just a quirk of the Firefox metrics collection. Google has their own version of this graph. It looks very similar, except that everything is up a couple points. So it looks the same, but shift the bar up a few percent. And I think that's mainly because Google's stuff tends to interact with Google more, which is always HGPS, pretty much. So they have a couple points over Firefox users on percentage, based mostly on use of Google services. Yeah. So not a pipe dream. This is an incredible change for people on the web. 3 to 5 years. The biggest variable is how aggressively browsers can start tamping down on HTTP. Here's some things you can do. The first one is my favorite. Anytime you set up a website, anytime somebody knows that's one up, your company, your partners, insist on HGPS. From the beginning, no question about it, needs to happen. Social media like however else you can do it, make your voice heard, demand HGPS. And you can support organizations that help further this plan. So yeah, thank you. We've made incredible progress. Lots of people have contributed.